Let me welcome you to the third annual Wallace Stegner Center Young Scholars Lecture. We're very pleased at the Stegner Center to host this event, which has become an annual part of the Stegner Center's programs over the course of the academic year. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Bob Kiter. I direct the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment here at the College of Law, which is designed as an interdisciplinary educational and research center addressing precisely those topics, land, water, and the environment. The Associate Center Director, walking out the door, Jan Nystrom, who has been very instrumental in bringing about today's program. And again, let me welcome you to the College of Law for this event. I also would like to thank the Cultural Vision Fund, which has been and does provide the critical support for the Young Scholars Program at the Wallace Stegner Center. Let me now introduce our young scholar, who is Jamison, or Jamie Colburn, who teaches environmental and natural resources law at Western New England College School of Law in Springfield, Massachusetts. Jamie's also served as an instructor at Columbia Law School and as a visiting professor at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. He teaches in the area of environmental and natural resources law, and prior to entering the academic world, served as assistant regional counsel to the Environmental Protection Agency during the Clinton years. He also serves as chair of the ABA committee that examines the intersection between environmental and constitutional law, and serves on the board of the Connecticut River Watershed. Jamie is a prolific scholar. His work has been published in a number of law journals that include the Alabama Law Review, the Arizona State Law Journal, the Ecology Law Quarterly, Florida State University Law Review, Rutgers Law Journal, Environmental Law, and several other journals. What he will be speaking on today, the title of which appears on the board, so I don't have to go through it, builds upon this prior scholarly work that he has done, which examines the intersection between law, conservation, ecology, and the role of local government and local communities in bringing about a more progressive conservation agenda. With no further ado, thank you for joining us today, Jim.
Before I start, I want to thank my friend Bob Kiter and the Stegner Center and all the people at the Stegner Center, Jan Nystrom, Bob Adler, and everyone else, and all of you for this wonderful opportunity. It's truly humbling, and I'm so happy to be here. And hopefully I did not get tripped up by my own PowerPoint slides here. Power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts, absolutely. Many of you have probably heard about the Healthy Forest Restoration Act and this idea of a wildland-urban interface. And it sounds like a boundary, but it's actually a very large and growing category of real estate. It's large and growing because, at least in part, because of its legal definition and how open-ended it is. But I also think it's large and growing because people like to live near public lands. Now, the forest season of 2000, which was the catalyst of the Healthy Forests Initiative, the precursor to the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, saw about 6.8 million acres of public lands burned. And that was about double the 10-year average at the time. It included about 75,000 wildfires. And most of those were very small fires. About 95% of them were under 100 acres, but that was because of really superhuman efforts to contain them and to put them out. Now, in a sense, the 20th century policy of fire suppression worked. By the 1970s, fire was occurring on only about 1/10 of the acreage that it had been occurring in the 1930s annually. But this wasn't a particularly wise land use policy, especially at this scale. The combination of growing fire-intolerant species, which are susceptible to insects and disease, which then create large stands and down piles of fuels, which are then dried in long spells of drought, create extreme fire risks. And I think that that proved over the course of the 1990s just how unwise the policy of fire suppression was. Now, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act was Washington's response. So what is this category of wildland-urban interface land? The statute's definition, which borrows a Federal Register definition, is an amalgam. There's a list of at-risk communities, 23 Federal Register pages strong, triple columns, a proviso to add at-risk communities as needed, a buffer zone of up to 1.5 miles, and any evacuation routes for all of these at-risk communities. And as you might imagine, this is a lot of territory. The only spatially explicit assessment that's been done was put together by some of the Forest Service's personnel at the North Central Research Station and some university professors. And what they came up with was this map. Now, there are a couple of color scales at work here, but the yellows and the light oranges, which are broken out into details here on the bottom. There's a detail from North Carolina, a detail from the Northern Forest, and a detail from the Bay Area. Gives you a little bit better idea of the amount of space that we're talking about as this wildland-urban interface. The red is non-vegetated or agricultural, and the green is just interior forest or interior vegetated. But this wildland-urban interface works out to be about 9.4% of the total surface area of the conterminous United States. More importantly, it includes 44.4 million housing units, or about 39% of all the houses in America. Now, when this statute passed in 2003, it was by a 2-to-1 margin in the House and almost a 6-to-1 margin in the Senate, the Healthy Forest Restoration. Now, that might have been because 2003 was about the high water mark of Luntz speak in Washington. Some of you may have heard of Frank Luntz, the Republican political consultant who brought us gems like healthy forests and clear skies, and up is down and black is white. But I also think that it shows what this legislation comes to in substance, and that's roughly this: not much. Now, it was a bump in appropriations. It was some procedural reforms as far as land management planning goes. And I guess what I would call some half-baked finger-wagging at the agencies like BLM and the Forest Service, that they coordinate with each other better, and especially that they coordinate with states and localities better to prevent catastrophic fire. Now, this is a graphic that shows you that funding has definitely gone up. Adjusted for inflation, we went from an average of about $1.3 billion annually for fire in fiscal years 96 to 2000 to an average of about $3.1 billion annually in fiscal years 2001 to 2005. And you'll see in these columns at the bottom where they break the numbers out that it is roughly from year to year about a 30, 50, 20 split of funding between what they call preparedness, suppression, and then my favorite category in government, other. And other includes emergency, supplemental, and contingent appropriations Congress provided to fund suppression. So a lot of this column is suppression. And actually it turns out that when you get into the numbers, a lot of this column is suppression too. Because when they talk about preparedness, they talk about appropriations for hiring, training, and paying fire organizations and personnel and acquiring equipment. And if you're buying firefighting equipment, I think you're preparing to suppress. So I would say that more than half of the money is still being spent on suppression. Now, it took until 1995 for the Forest Service finally to admit publicly that fire is a natural element of most forest ecosystems. In fact, if you look at a long enough time scale, fire is a natural element of just about every forest ecosystem. Now, this is a map of the contiguous United States of what they call current condition classes in historical fire frequency. Now, there are actually 3 scales of color on here: the reds, the browns, and the greens. And that's to depict differences in fire regimes. The greens are the longest fire regime, meaning there should be about an interval of 200 years between fires. The browns are 35 to 100 years in interval between fires naturally, and the reds are much shorter, as you can see. in the West, living here with somewhat frequent fires. The darker the color gets, the greater the condition class of risk is, thanks to land management practices across the country. So wherever you see dark colors, there's a higher risk of a severe fire when it does come. But even at 200 years, I mean, that's a lot of time in the human time frame, but ecologically it's not so long. So still, after a decade after the Forest Service admitted that fire is a natural part of ecosystems, it's still spending, by some estimates, as much as 40% of its entire budget on suppressing fires. So this Healthy Forest Initiative and this Healthy Forest Restoration Act was to focus on hazardous fuels reduction projects. And why? Well, I think it's pretty clear why. Radeloff is a Forest Service researcher. He was funded by the Forest Service, I should say. He works at the University of Wisconsin. He led this study that gave us that map of the wildland-urban interface I mentioned and showed. But he estimates that 8.6 million new homes have been built in the West within 30 miles of a national forest since 1982. From 1982 to 1997, population in this country only grew by 17%, but the urbanized areas grew by almost 100%. Projections are that this wildland-urban interface is actually going to grow by another 30 to 40 million acres before 2030. So you can see why they're spending at least half, probably more than half, on fire suppression in the wildland-urban area. Now, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act actually doesn't define the hazardous fuels reduction projects. They are referenced in an administrative document, this implementation plan that's described in Section 102A of the Act. So you go to Section 102A of the Act, try to decide what this implementation plan is, and it's something called the Implementation Plan for the Comprehensive Strategy for a Collaborative Approach for Reducing Wildland Fire Risks to Communities and the Environment, developed pursuant to an appropriations law, and subsequent revisions. Now, I was a little stymied here because I thought to myself, it's not put in a law, it's not put in a set administrative document, it's put in a set administrative document that can be revised. So as I was looking for these, I thought, well, these tactics have got to be better than sliced bread, because what they're trying to do is reverse almost 90 years of a failed policy, 90 years of system-wide fire suppression. And I have a good long time thinking about this, trying to find what these things were. And so I find this document finally, and I look in the glossary, and the glossary defines appropriate tools in this way. And now I'm starting to think that these hazardous fuel reduction projects are classified or something. Methods for reducing hazardous fuels, including prescribed fire, wildland fire use, and various mechanical methods, such as crushing, etc. Tree removal, as I'm sure you all realize, in pruning, they are selected on a site-specific case and are ecologically appropriate and cost-effective. Even when I was in government, I used to call this Washington speak. Now, a serious point I think here is this. What do we have natural resources law for? If we can't put these hazardous fuel reduction projects down on paper, put them into the legislation and establish them as what bounds the agency's discretion, I kind of wonder what we have natural resources legislation for. You have to actually go to the legislative history of an appropriations bill from 2001 to find what Congress expected these multiple use agencies to be doing in reducing wildland-urban interface fire risk. And this is prose that just rolls off the tongue. They have to develop with the governors a long-term strategy to deal with wildland fire and hazardous fuels situation, as well as the needs for habitat restoration and rehabilitation in the nation. Now we're going to say, how do you prioritize those things, right? Wrong. The managers of the bill expected a collaborative structure with the states and local governments. Don't worry if you can't read that print. It's printed all over the Forest Service's document now. Will be the most efficient and effective way of implementing a long-term program. And it goes on to say what the managers expect about close collaboration, but no guidance whatsoever on what the managers expect to be the prioritization of the money that they're creating or the authority that they're delegating to the agency to pursue this wildland-urban interface fire risk reduction. Now the key part here, of course, is that at the end, key decisions, whatever those should be made at local levels. Now, a long time ago, natural resources legislation stopped being the creator of actual rights and duties. It stopped being the source of actual rights and duties. And it became a series of blueprints to agencies to specify people's rights and duties where public lands go. But I don't think it's even that much anymore, when that is the organic legislation, really, that the Forest Service and BLM have to pursue fire risk reductions. Organic legislation has come a long way, if that's what we have. All right, now the Act also calls for the preparation of community wildfire protection plans, or CWPs. And these plans are supposed to define the wildland-urban interface as well as establish local strategic priorities for wildfire preparedness. But as you might imagine, not much of the federal funding goes here, and even if it did, what I know about the land management agencies tells me that they would probably have to outsource this community work even if there was real money. Neither the Forest Service or the BLM even seem that much interested in these plans, whether it's a matter of substance or process. The Government Accountability Officer, GAO, recently found, earlier this year actually, that while 95% of the agency's land management units had completed their own fire plans, none of the agencies required that these plans be at all connected to the community plans in the area, or that they be updated with new data, or that they be collaborative in fact at a planning level. In fact, if the agencies are collecting any data at all about these plans, their performance, their improvement, etc., it's hard to tell. The community wildfire protection plans seem to be an afterthought to the agencies bureaucratically, and they are absolutely a hot potato politically. Because as soon as the conversation turns to planning land uses in communities around fire instead of vice versa, these agencies want to have nothing to do with the conversation. So what is being accomplished by these plans? I have to say, I don't know. The only data that's even being collected is bean counting data. How many of these plans are being done? Not their substance and not what they've been designed to achieve. So what data does the Forest Service collect? The Forest Service and BLM are collaborating on a $40 million database that they call Landfire. And it's intended to produce comprehensive shareable maps and data describing vegetation, fuels, fire regimes, etc. across the country. Unfortunately, nobody has figured out how this data is going to be kept current. Geospatial data like this is exceptionally costly to collect, to manage, and to share. Now, admittedly, some of those costs are probably coming down as satellite imagery improves and training costs are reduced. But if so, the agencies aren't letting on because their budget demands keep growing. Mechanical fuel removal, which is one category of hazardous fuel reduction project alone, has been pushed up over 1 million acres a year. And this is a picture that the Forest Service and BLM like to point out, how these goals are exceeding the baseline year for the millions of acres of hazardous fuel reductions in landscape restoration activities, most of which are in the wildland-urban interface, some of which are in non-wildland-urban areas. But I have to say, if it's true that you manage what you measure, I don't think it's a good sign that they're collecting data like this. This is the kind of data that bean counters like. No matter what the project, its effects are going to be temporary. Money might not grow on trees, but fuel certainly does. So as they treat one of these acres and consider it fixed, I don't think they're seeing a real problem. Now, I did come across this one-pager, which might be of interest to people in the audience. This is the one-pager that the BLM has on the fire plan effort here in Salt Lake City. And this is it. This is the only thing that they tell you about whatever great work is being done in Salt Lake City as an area regarding community fire planning. You know, they started off by saying project descriptions involved cutting and thinning juniper trees in an effort to reduce the threats. And people were generally oblivious to the fire threat the first year out. That was the summer of 2002. Now they say fast forward 365 days, and things have gotten a lot better. What a difference a year can make. People actually have questions now. Not that we can answer them. And I cut it off, but there was a contact point at the bottom here for a BLM person down in the southern part of the state, not even in the Salt Lake field office. I called that number seeking some more information about this particular fire plan. And I was told that the person who was my point of contact was actually on vacation till November, but that they would try to find somebody else to help me. And I sat on hold for 10 minutes until I finally decided that this little exercise was probably costing my dean too much money. But my point is that they're not gathering data on the right questions. Now, the empirical work that I can confirm the agencies are doing includes studying the popularity of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. Really? A team of researchers in Minnesota led by Jane Johnson, a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, funded by the Forest Service, studied how this Healthy Forest Restoration Act was playing in the press. They collected 2,800 news stories from this period of time, from August of 2002 to December of 2004, and they coded them. And during the same period of time, there were about 45,000 stories on wildfire venom. And these are their findings. The Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003, on the favorable belief side about the act, it reduces fire risk, constituted about close to 40% of the favorable beliefs that people have. It cuts red tape, that was a big one too. Protects people, well, now we're getting down into the marginal level. Collaborative, yeah, there might have been some person out there, probably a BLM employee, that says that it was collaborative. What about on unfavorables? Well, as you might imagine, stealth logging came up quite a lot. That was a commonly expressed unfavorable belief. Generally unfavorable, I don't know if it's associated with bush, I'm against it. And so forth. And then when they put the data together, they find that they've got a problem as far as favorables versus unfavorables. They've got to get those unfavorables down. Sounds a lot like Washington. The other thing I was able to find out is that the Forest Service is actually studying home ignitability. So for example, Cohen, who is a research scientist for the Forest Service in Missoula, found that the key to reducing wildland-urban interface home fire losses is to reduce home ignitability. Now, with some modeling and some case studies, Cohen showed, not so surprisingly in my mind, that a home's structural characteristics, meaning a non-flammable roof, for example, and its immediate surroundings determine a home's ignition potential in the wildland-urban interface fire. To ensure that your house won't ignite, given the intensity of some of the crown fires lately, Cohen recommends that a 40-meter buffer zone around all of a home's structures be maintained. Now, as you might imagine, what this probably does is increase the disturbance footprint of all of our sprawl. But does it really address the basic problem? I mean, does it even address the basic problem? I know that shrinking the NEPA process, which is another thing that the Healthy Forest Restoration Act did, doesn't address the basic problem. And let me just grant that increasing people's awareness of the ignitability of their home may save lives over the short term at least, given how oblivious many people have become to their natural surroundings. But the basic problems of this wildland-urban interface are being created as it expands, as more homes are being built up to, and in fact, in some cases, right in what's left of the wild. Our basic problem isn't even being confronted by this statute. And in fact, I think it's probably worsening the problem. The conservation cause has paid insufficient attention in my mind to history, especially the history of conservation efforts. Now, I've argued elsewhere that public land laws that we have, which were all legislated in a burst roughly from 1964 to about 1976, are actually a continuation of a much longer phenomenon in American history. In order to settle disagreements that we have about how we ought to use land, we divide it up. Statutes like the Forest and Rangeland Renewable Resources Planning Act, the National Forest Management Act, the Federal Land Policy Management Act, the National Wildlife Refuge System Act, and the 1997 Improvement Act of that act, they all boil down to legal requirements to plan land uses on a unit-by-unit basis, like what we see up here, supposedly to achieve many goals at once. And what's actually being produced is zoning. By the 1960s, I think many Americans believed that blocking access to land and excluding civilization entirely was at least one good land use. Some Americans even believed that it was the only good land use. Since then, this national wilderness preservation system that we have has grown spectacularly, but not quite how you might think. Most of it is in Alaska, 85% of it, in fact. The vast majority of land in the 48 conterminous United States is either urban or is multiple use land, the vast majority of it. The fraction of that, which is public land, is supposed to be managed by experts who are above politics and trying to sustain our civilization, sustain our extractive uses, our recreation, and maybe one of these days carbon sequestration. But the history of these systems, I think, shows that any rational attempt to achieve sustainable land use, sustainable multiple use, requires a far deeper and broader understanding of the ecology of the land than we can usually get. The technocratic vision of expert agencies with all the expertise they can afford, or that we can afford, has always been too strong for its own good. We can't make legal rules that even come close to these ideals because we can't even imagine what those legal rules are. Thus, we have completely unrealistic expectations of our agencies, and it shouldn't surprise us that the only way they end up being able to achieve both serenity in some wildland escape and ORV use is to separate the two. We cling to a fiction that legislation is what gives these agencies their democratic legitimacy, but we refuse to afford them enough legal authority to dispose of things like valid existing rights under RS 2477, or to engage in landscape scale planning across the boundary lines of their individual property units. Now, I want to be clear. I am not saying that any of this could or necessarily should change. But what I wonder is why we are not recognizing that deeply contentious emotional issues like what is good land use aren't being resolved at the scale that our nation has become. We keep legislating federal jurisdiction into existence and then starve the federal agencies of the resources they need to actually use that jurisdiction to achieve the common good. So let me share a couple of speculations. First, agencies are never forthcoming about how little they can achieve in the real world. Real expertise would make agency managers admit, and I think even broadcast, their own fallibility. Fire suppression in the 20th century was the agency's idea originally. The problem is that broadcasting agency fallibility is usually not a career path for advancement in government, unless, of course, you're elected. Second, as a nation, we have simply never funded science or really any kind of exploratory practice at even close to what's needed to achieve the technocratic vision of land use. I have to confess, I shudder today when I hear the word sustainability. I can't even sustain my garden for very many years without lots and lots of inputs of water and fertilizer. How are we going to sustain our way of life at the current levels with the kind of expertise that we actually have? Third, in the context of fire, where the threat and the path to correction really do operate at landscape scales, the differentiation of land systems and bureaus throughout their different land use zoning creations seems to me to be self-evidently wrong. Now you get a sense of this from the structure of the Department of Interior and Forest Service decision-making process. It's summit-like. It's like superpowers meeting, where they have to meet first at a neutral location, and they have to agree to a neutral vocabulary, and then they have to agree to decision-making procedures. And once they agree to the decision-making procedures, then they have vague allusions to consensus that doesn't really exist. I mean, these theatrics are starting to cost us a lot. And I think it comes down to this. Coordination, where there is deep disagreement at very large scales, is just too costly, too difficult. Now finally, I'd like to share something that George Perkins Marsh, somebody who I admire a lot and I've read a lot of, once said. And it's this: man is a disturbing agent, and wherever he sets his foot, the harmonies of nature are set to discords. Now, he wasn't a feminist, so I don't think there was that kind of truth in what he said. In my view, this was a misanthropic view of land use, though. The only healthy landscapes are the ones that don't have people. I think that shows how stunted wilderness is as a concept. How stunted it is as a conservation vehicle in our legal culture as it actually is. It makes conservation exceptional by design. The wilderness areas there that you see on the map are the exception. And they're certainly the exception across the entirety of our land system. But I also think it gives people a false sense of accomplishment. Put that area there up on a pedestal, and then protect it. And then let's get back to the real business of mining more oil and gas. Now, I'm not saying that we need more spaces where people have gone in and compromised the health of the land. What I'm saying is that wilderness as a legal concept is flawed because it's fragmentative by nature. I think wilderness is its own pharmacon, in Derrida's sense. It's a poison and a medicine all in one. In a country of so many people with so much wealth, if wilderness is the only place that land is healthy, then that's where people are going to want to be. And I think this is the wildland-urban interface problem. I have to say, there are more timber investment management organizations in our future. These TIMOs, I think some people have probably heard of them. In 1993, there were only 2 of them. Today, there are more than 24, and they manage almost $16 billion in land. Real estate investment trusts, like Plum Creek, are another vehicle that conservationists had better learn about fast. These ownership entities, I think, are replacing timber companies in America $1 billion in land at a time. Timberland, the fact is, timberland and canyon country land is far more valuable as mansions for entry-level monarchs and for hotels and for golf courses and ski slopes than it is as a tax break. And that's just a strict market phenomenon. National mortgage markets, by the way, might be tanking right now, but these investments aren't slowing very much at all. With all this money at stake, I have to say it's probably no wonder that researchers trying to understand fire and its role on a landscape are attacked when they challenge the conventional wisdom. I just read about this kid at Oregon State. His name is Dan Donato. He was a PhD candidate studying fire ecology, and he was doing field research after Oregon's Big Biscuit fire a couple years ago. Science magazine was ready to publish a little snippet of his team's findings, pointing out that conifer seedlings were actually reestablishing themselves after this big fire. Conventional wisdom said that conifer seedlings shouldn't be reestablishing themselves there, and it's convenient to believe that they don't if you want to do a little bit of salvage logging after a fire, because you won't be harming the land by going out there and doing salvage logging. Now here we have somebody doing actual research, collecting actual data about what's going on the land when fire happens. And he's hauled before the Oregon legislature and bullied it. People called Science magazine and bullied it, trying to get it to pull the paper. They didn't. They ended up publishing it because it withstood all the scrutiny. And this kid has to spend a year of his life fending off all these attacks. And I think this is what our public processes look like now when scientific consensus changes course, which is what scientific consensus is supposed to do. So one thing fire tells us is that, one thing that science tells us is that fire needs heat, oxygen, and fuel to burn. I had to look this up. And our agencies have decided that the only thing they can control is fuel. The problem is that stand-level fuels treatment turns out to be very complicated. If you don't use the right tool based on accurate information, you could actually make the problem worse. If you thin out an area, you increase wind speeds and possibly allow wind to feed the fire. You also change the way insects disperse, and you possibly exacerbate insect infestation. Now, does all that mean that all of these millions of acres of treatment that we're getting are the next continentally scaled big mistake by our expert agencies? I don't know. We really don't have any data on that. So what should be done? I think we've moved unknowingly to a point where our expert agencies have lost their practical authority. The media is skeptical of them. Politicians are skeptical of them. The courts are skeptical of them. The Chevron doctrine looks like Swiss cheese today. And I know that Westerners are skeptical of these agencies. So I'd like to start the conversation that I hope we can have in the time that we've got left by asking why we still have these agencies if they're so illegitimate. Now here's one hope. If there's one job that localities and states have shown they can't do well at all, it's pooling their experiences and comparing their own performances. Information pooling and benchmarking is something normally should be done by third parties. Monitoring and reflecting back someone's shortcomings compared to a cohort is something very different from setting conduct standards or even general goals. It's a role that none of our land management agencies are taking very seriously at all right now. But if new federal legislation reforming public lands law is in the cards, I think it should focus on this structural idea pretty seriously. In my view, land planning people in this country cannot move forward until they take two basic realities very seriously. First, administrative agencies are incapable of remaining adaptive over the long term. The administrative agency is simply not an institutional technology that sustains experimentation for one reason. Routines are like oxygen to an administrative agency. Second, local police powers of any stripe are almost always made to serve the competitive ends of their particular municipality. A municipality that uses its land use planning powers to meet the needs of its region is the exception, believe me. But there's one dynamic here that makes this exception the norm, I think. When localities have to cooperate to oppose forces that are more threatening than their neighbors. And I think wildfire is one of those forces. If our agencies could actually pool information about local performances on things like wildfire planning and push that information out quickly and widely, benchmark communities' performances to show who are the leaders and laggards, and perhaps even establish rolling best practices on huge problems like fire, then I think we will have addressed the institutional challenges of large-scale and small-scale land planning in the U.S. In my view, if we can do that, we have a shot at a more meaningful discussion, a more meaningful dialogue about what is good land use. And I think it would certainly be a more restorative step than the practice of subsidizing wildland sprawl with the appropriations train that this Healthy Forest Restoration Act started. So with that, I want to thank you all, and I hope there are questions.
So I guess my main question is, I mean, you've explained that this is a very broad issue. There's a lot of elements that go into it. So in your mind, what's the number one most urgent element that needs to be addressed? If you were king of America and you could do what you wanted, what's the first thing that you think needs to happen?
Well, I have to say, I think asking that question is the problem. I think we've too long had legal scholars and we've too long had agency officials who think that they're kings or they think they're imperfect kings. I think what we have to do is have a lot of people in rooms like this that actually live on the landscapes decide what the number one urgent problem for them is in their bioregion, in their region, in their locale. I think that's the first step. What you wind up with, if that's the only step, right, are a lot of people who aren't learning and who possibly get stuck in ruts and who, you know, the wheel hasn't been invented here, so they only use things that are invented here and like it. And that's, I think, the role of the federal government. That's the structural role the federal government can play, which is to pool information about what problems are in fact being solved. Oh, you can't protect your watershed lands with the money that you have at the same time as you protect your actual housing subdivisions. Well, you know what? Somebody down the canyon figured out a way to do that. How come you can't perform as well as their performance. And if that's the agency's role, you see, the agency isn't dictating how the funding is going to be prioritized as far as wildland-urban fire goes. What they're doing is saying, all right, there are different priorities, and we disagree about what those priorities are and how they should be set. But this is somebody that shares your priorities, and this is how well they perform. I think that's what I'm looking for with respect to federal legislation and agency.
I'm just wondering, and I haven't put it on urban law interfaces, I've told you. And so it hasn't happened to me yet, but to what extent are insurance companies reacting and raising money?
Not much. Not much. It seems to me that, and I was talking with, I had the good fortune of talking with Bob Kreider about this yesterday. Insurance companies still feel fire losses from wildland-urban fire as like a round here, compared to hurricanes and other kinds of catastrophic occurrences. The losses that the insurers are experiencing is not going to change their behavior. It's not changing. It's like a blip on their policy writing behavior, which I think behind your question is implicitly that maybe they are the ones to police what's going on. But so far, I don't think that incentive is arisen.
If I put your talk together correctly, I take it on the one hand you're saying that public lands in general, maybe wilderness in particular, tend to attract people, visitors, hotels, golf courses, summer homes, etc. And they are creating the problems associated with the wildland-urban interface. On the other hand, a specific problem with the Wilderness Act and with wilderness is that it quote excludes people. Even though I've gone to many wilderness, and I don't know quite what you mean. But on the face of it, that sounds paradoxical. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit and hopefully clarify what you mean.
Sure, I think the Wilderness Act doesn't exclude people. I mean, it excludes civilization, right? You can't take motorized vehicles, and there are even strict rules as to when you can use motorized vehicles if you're an agency and there's some exigency that you have to try to deal with. You can't build there. You aren't supposed to be really any commercial enterprises at all. An interesting case I just saw was the agency deciding that they wouldn't allow this outfit, which had put itself together to spread people's ashes in the wilderness areas. They were charging a fee for spreading the ashes in the wilderness area, and because that was a commercial activity, they couldn't get a special use permit to go into the wilderness area. So I didn't want to misspeak and say that people can't go into wilderness areas. People can't build their homes in wilderness areas, and they can't usually build their homes on public multiple use lands either. But if that's what we are seeking as a people, if that's what we think is healthy land use, that's where people are going to want to get as close as they can possibly get to.
But that's the very paradox that I see, what you're saying. On the one hand, these public lands attract people, and on the other hand, they, in some ways, exclude them, and that's why they attract them, at least on the periphery. So what sort of solution, at least in general terms, do you see?
Well, I mean, one solution, and I'm not sure that it's a solution, but one step forward is to stop zoning quite the way that we're zoning, and to start zoning more cognizant of the long-term effects of the zoning. And the long-term effects of the zoning are in places like southern Utah, where each one of these townships that are in boulders are potentially an attraction to more people. Now supposedly you've got protection of this national monument by a Smith move in the Clinton administration, but that doesn't seem to me to be a long-term protection of that landscape in southern Utah. And if we're looking to the federal agencies to engage in kind of, in any kind of landscape scale planning in southern Utah, it's just not going on. So when I say that I think that wilderness-based planning is defective, it's not that I think that it's not a well-meaning step, or that people, the conservationists, Brower and the like, that took these steps originally were misguided. I think that we stopped, and we haven't developed any further than that. And in large measure because I think people are made to feel as though urban environments aren't healthy environments. And that might be part of the problem as to why people want to get out of all these urban environments.
Maybe we should improve our urban environment.
We should look to nature that's right around us first before we start pedestalizing wilderness. But I agree there is something of a paradox there.
I'm kind of radical in this. I see people with their summer homes or their winter homes or whatever in the Brighton area around the national parks. And with my little disintegration gun, I say, go away. But, you know, to have something like eminent domain, we're going to take you out of this national forest where your family has been for 100 years, and you've built up the footprint, so now you have a little McMansion. This is a really unpopular thing.
Really unpopular.
Because property rights are, you know, sacred in America. But do you see anything on the growing edge of zoning and planning that might predict something like that coming down the line in...
The eminent domain action?
Well, at least zoning first and then the eminent domain.
Well, I think zoning, to the extent that it discloses a community's objectives, is good. I think that that's a positive step. It forces people, if that's actually the process that gives you the zoning plan, and unfortunately in a lot of areas it's not. In a lot of communities, zoning and community planning is just the opposite. It's a developer-driven phenomenon. But if you get a process at the local level that actually involves people and forces them to deliberate about what good land use, at least in their jurisdiction, looks like, then I think when the point comes at which there's a holdout of some kind, like your inholder, and state authority, state power actually has to be used, it becomes much less of a tragedy and much less of a media circus than what we've seen recently with cases like Kilo and Supreme Court and whatnot. Because it lays the groundwork for establishing what that community's goals and what that community's deepest felt priorities actually are, instead of springing them on people all of a sudden and saying, well, you're in the way of this next shopping mall or my wilderness experience. So I think that there is an important process element, for sure. That's why.
I'd like to take that on just a little bit farther. If you look at the map that you have up there, you see section after section of state school sections that have been set aside.
These little white dots.
And every one of those are currently under the administration of the State Institutional Trust Lands Administration, which is in the business of selling those off and maximizing the income to be generated by the sale or disposition of those lands. And you can imagine what that means with regard to the issue that you're
Absolutely.
talking about.
Well, St. George, I gather, is one of the biggest attractions
Well,
right now.
Yeah, except that in some places that has been resolved. There are a lot of others that are much more problematic in some ways. But the big overwhelming question, it seems to me, that raises comes back to the question that was just asked. That is, we have built up a concept of property rights that is so inflexible and so rigid that we cannot solve a problem of this kind. And it requires, it would seem to me, a much more radical thinking about how to deal with the disposition of those claimed rights. And I'm wondering if you're thinking at all in that direction.
I am. And anything that I can respond to that question, I think it's the question is tentative at best. And I think that Eric Flacco in Illinois and some others have started to point in this direction where rethinking property at a very basic level is really where we have to start to get past any of these roadblocks that we're hitting. And part of me is as unhopeful that that's going to happen as you seem to be. On the other hand, part of me says that places like this, where law students are all the time now being educated and are, thankfully sort of pushing all of us out just gradually in terms of demographics, is where it starts, and where really radically different ideas and improved ideas of property start at the educational level. So I think it goes to that level. And I'm not sure what our hope for success would be, but I agree that that's the sort of concept that we have to aim at.
Assuming we do get the information, that we also start collecting it properly, and that the federal government really does come up with a policy, but assuming that demographic patterns don't change, the people's desires don't change, and the population continues to grow, do you think we'll have to craft a national fire policy or wilderness policy that kind of backs away from a holistic ecosystem view and says, well, we're just going to have to be realistic, and what we envisioned and desired and want to protect is not going to be protected?
Well, this is where I get really unpopular, because I don't think that we've actually achieved eco-regional or ecosystemic thinking on our national land systems. I think that's been a lot of talk. I think, unfortunately, an ecosystem is not a place. It's a series of relationships. And so I would try to, I would try to divert the question a little bit and talk about actual places. And where you have real people in an actual place with investment in that place sit down and they try to balance extractive uses and motorized recreation and more passive uses, it turns out that they can actually do it. They can do it tolerably well. And they can do it much better, I think, than Washington or the administrative agencies that are always subject to lawsuits. But I think that that's going to be an inherently incremental thing. Because I personally have only one opinion as to what good land use is, and I don't even know, I change that day to day sometimes. I don't even know what good land use is, given what we're learning about how all of these land uses in the past that we thought were good are turning out to have globally significant consequences. So my answer to the question is, it's an inherently incremental thing, and the smaller the chunks are, the more likely the real people will be able to solve it.